be live. Well, this is my first time going live, so this is going to be a test run for me just as much as it is actually doing a Bible study. But at the moment, I don't seem to see my live on my own screen, which is annoying. So I just want to make sure that I am live. Yes, that seems to work. So I've decided to start doing my lives and using my Bible studies. Instead of doing quick, short Bible study videos, I am going to do lives Bible studies. So I'm going to adjust my method I used in my Bible studies, because in my Bible studies, in the short videos I made, I used a quick version where I just asked who, when, where, what is the context or the angle. And also, an interesting one was when I asked, but how do we embody this? And then I asked, how can we do it? And then I ended with, what's a wisdom phrase we can make? With this one, I am changing my approach a little bit. I don't want to really focus on how quick I can do it, because that was the focus with the video version. What I want to do in the live stream is I want to go through those questions again, and I want to ask like who, when, where. See, all these bold ones are the questions, and then the explanation for the questions in the smaller text. But so I'm going to use this to go through the text. The text we're going to do today is Hebrews 6. We're going to do verse 9 to 12, which I highlighted over here. But we're going to ask these questions to study it, or we're going to take these steps rather, because this is way more in depth than what I did on the videos. So the first step we're going to take is we're going to ask who. We're going to look at who's involved, anyone who's mentioned, any person who is in the text. We're going to look at people mentioned. We're going to look at abstractions. And then also with the when. Is there any time? Is there a moment? Is there a time frame? Is there expectancy of time? Is there an abstraction of time? We're going to ask that. The same with the where. The same thing again, like something specific, something like a general area or a movement being made from one place to a different place, or even an abstraction of place. An abstraction of place would be something like heaven, because we don't know what heaven really is. It's a word we like to use and we think we know what it means, but we don't really. Then the next one is going to be context. And here we're going to look at the context of the letter. But we're going to look deeper than just the main story, which I said with Hebrews the entire time. We're going to look at the context of the specific passage, of the chapter, of the entire book. We're going to see how it fits into the Bible with a next step, not there yet. But then we're going to look at cultural backgrounds. Is there any cultural thing that I need to be aware of when we look at this? Then we're going to do a word study. And if there's a word in the passage that we want to study in the original, in the Greek or in the Hebrew, maybe just the English word for it, what is it used for as a theme in the Bible? We're going to take a closer look at that. Then we're going to look at the biblical timeline, the chronology of the Bible. Where does it fit into everything that's happening? Now, because we're doing a book study, it's going to remain stagnant among places, but it's still important to remember what happened before, what happens after, so that we know where we are in the biblical chronology, in the storyline of the Bible. Then we're going to look at propositions, any fact statements that the book makes. Anything we see in the Bible that's like, here is what it says. Then we're going to ask perspective. What is the perspective we need to take to be able to understand the text like the original audience would have? Then we're going to look at actions, and we're going to look at verbs. Now, there's two kinds of actions in the Bible. There is descriptive, which says what happened. Then there is prescriptive, which is telling you what to do. We're going to distinguish between those two, and we're going to identify, but what's the verbs I can do in my life to live out this passage? Then we're going to look at embodiment, and we're going to ask, but what kind of person do I need to be? Not the things that I have to do, because works can be faked, but the kind of person you have to be in your heart to be the kind of person that's described in the text. Then we're going to look at the biblical story, but as a meta-narrative. So in the first step, we looked at the biblical timeline. That is just where are we in the Bible's chronology. When we look at the meta-narrative, or how this meme, this idea of this passage fits into the rest of the biblical narrative, we're going to look at the story from creation until the eschaton, until the return of Christ and the restoration of all things. And we're going to ask ourselves, how is this idea spread throughout the entire Bible? How does it unfold in Scripture? So that's going to be taking a step back and looking way deeper than we would have otherwise. And then we're going to, once again, like always, formulate a phrase. But this will be more like a one-sentence summary of the lesson instead of a wisdom phrase, because we're going to have a lot of things. And deciding what's the core lesson you take away from this is going to be a lot of work. And it's going to take some thinking by the time you reach this point, because you're going to do a lot of things to get here. And by the time you get here, it's going to be important, but what is the one main takeaway? What do I see that it all hinges upon? And this, once I actually get an audience and people are watching, I'll start doing some metacognition where we ask ourselves, but why am I thinking this? What's happening inside of my mind that I am seeing this? And yeah, that's going to be interesting. It's going to be hard, but we're going to need a chat to get that going, because I'm not going to be able to do it on my own. Then it will just be me analyzing myself, and that's going to sound like me talking nonsense the entire time. So let's read the passage that we are doing today, and I underlined it here in the red. So it says, "But even if we are speaking in this way, dear friends, we are convinced of better things concerning you and belonging to salvation. For God is not unjust, as to forget the work and the love which you have demonstrated for his name by having served the saints and continuing to serve them. And we desire each one of you to demonstrate the same diligence for the full assurance of hope until the end, in order that you may not be sluggish, but imitators of those who inherit the promises through faith and patience." I wonder if there is a way to move my chat so it's more readable from the angle I'm sitting at. But yeah, it doesn't seem like I'll be able to do that, so I'll move myself. Problem solved. So the question we're going to ask ourselves now is who? Do we see any persons in this passage? And we do see people in this passage. First, we see that, but even if we are speaking this way, I'm going to take just a we. I'm going to put a color box around it. So we, this is the author of the text, which is unknown. We don't know who the author was. We don't know the person who wrote this text. Then we're going to read on and we say, "Dear friends." And here we have the friends. I'm going to put a color box onto that. And we can ask ourselves who the friends are. And the friends are the people he is speaking with. It's the people he's writing to. So this will be the audience. And the audience of this passage is the people who are being written to. It's the Jews in the diaspora. It's the Jews who were being tempted to walk away from the faith, to walk away from Christ because of the persecution that they were suffering. We are convinced of better things concerning you and belonging to salvation. For God, that's definitely a person that we need to mark in this text. Why? I don't want to do that. For God is not unjust, so God is a person who's in this text that we need to pay attention for. As to forget your work and the love you have demonstrated for his name by having served the saints and continuing to serve them. And we desire each one of you to demonstrate the same diligence for full assurance of hope until the end, in order that you may not be sluggish, but imitators of those who inherit the promises. So, those who inherit the promises, that's definitely a group of people that we need to pay attention to in this passage. So we're going to have to ask ourselves, who are the people who inherit the promises? That we're going to get to when we get to the context of the passage. So I'm going to try and avoid not to get ahead of myself with that one. That's a lot of times the most difficult thing with Bible study, to focus on what you're actually studying, not to get ahead of yourself and starting to do other things. Now we're going to ask ourselves, when? Is there any time in this passage that we need to take into account to understand what's happening? What does the time mean? So, but even if we are speaking in this way, so I'm going to mark the even if in a double box, because they are busy saying something to the audience. He is busy speaking with the people. That's a time that we can take into account. We are convinced of better things concerning you and belonging to salvation. For God is not unjust as to forget the work and love which you demonstrated for his name, having served the saints. So here we can take the which you demonstrated. We can definitely mark that as a time happening in the text, because they have worked. They are busy working and they are being tempted to walk away from the work. So there is currently something happening concerning the work with this audience. And by having served the saints and continuing to serve them. So here we can definitely having served. See, they served in the past and they are continuing to serve. So the demonstration was in the past, but it's also continuing. These people, even though they are being tempted to walk away from the faith, is continually walking, continually doing what they're supposed to be doing, even though it's hard, even though they are starting to receive that temptation to turn their backs on Christ. And we desire that each one of you to demonstrate the same diligence for the full assurance of your hope until the end. So until the end. So the author of this passage is trying to motivate the audience to keep going, to keep working, to keep doing, not to give up. So that's very important, until the end. So this is going to be motivation to keep working until your time to work is done. In order that you may not be sluggish, but imitators of those who inherit the promises through faith and patience. So let's say in order that, because that's going to be an important time indication. It is going to show us the kind of idea that we need to work now so that we may not be sluggish. But what for? but imitators of those who inherited the promises through faith and patience. I'm going to put the inherit in a double box as well, because that's indicating still future time. They are still going to receive the inheritance if they keep following Christ or serving the saints, doing the work. Now we move on to where. So now we're going to start asking, but where are these people? Is there any place indicated? Is there any person mentioned in this passage that we need to keep an eye on? And when we look at the where, Hebrews is not going to have a lot of that. But when it does, it's going to be very important to pay attention to where. But even if we are speaking in this way, dear friends, we are convinced of better things concerning you and belonging to salvation. For God is not unjust as to forget your work and your love, which you demonstrated for his name by having served the saints and continuing to serve them. Um, 11. And we desire each of you to demonstrate the same diligence for the full assurance of hope until the end, in order that you may not be sluggish, but imitators of those who inherit the promises through faith and patience. So we don't see a place in this specific passage. So that question we can just pass. So context is our next step we're going to look at. And the context of the book of Hebrews so far is the writer, unknown, writing to an audience that is existing of Jews in the diaspora, believing Jews who accepted Christ. But they are being tempted to turn their back on Christ so that they can live an easier life, because they were being persecuted. They were being killed for their faith. In a lot of places, there were laws that they were not allowed to participate in any economic activity. Like they were not allowed to have a job. They were not allowed to buy things from the market because they refused to worship to Caesar. And a lot of Roman cities had a rule that you have to sacrifice to Caesar, offer incense to him and say that Caesar is Lord before you're allowed to participate in economic activity. So they were tempted. They wanted to turn their back on God. But now the author is writing to them, turn your back on Christ towards what? Going back to Judaism? Because in Judaism, you still had to offer sacrifices, but Christ is a better sacrifice. In Judaism, you had a law, but Christ was better than Moses. Christ gave a better law. Christ is better than the angels. No angelic message will ever be as great as the message of Christ. And the author of Hebrews almost paints this picture of, are you silly? Why do you want to turn your back on Christ? There is no reason to do this. There is no sense in this. So to read a bit more of the context, I'm going to open up one of my commentaries, which is the Lexham Context Commentary. And the fun thing about the Lexham Context Commentary is it gives you the context, so you don't have to guess what the context is. And let me just make this a bit bigger as well, so you can read along with me. So the context of chapter 6, but this is only verse 1 to 8. We're doing verse 9 to 12. So let's scroll down. Here is 9 to 12. The better things of salvation. And this is the Lexham Context Commentary. This section brings from the reprimand of warning of the previous 2 paragraphs to the assurance of the following portion of the letter. Here the author expresses confidence and hopeful future of the readers, commending them to their good work. At the same time, The tone of the exhortation continues from the previous paragraph. He challenges them not to join complacently with confidence. So in verse 9 specifically, he says, having just warned them of the possibility of being cursed and destroyed, if they will fall away from faith, the author now seeks to build his readers back up. He reassures them that while those terrifying statements of the previous paragraph are true insofar as the conditions of the curse are met, he is confident that they will come to the fruition in their lives of those to whom he is writing. He is convinced that their future holds the better things that belong to salvation. The confidence expressed in verse 9 has its basis in the character of God. The love and good works of the readers are commended, and it is those works manifested in their servanthood towards the saint that God will be faithful to remember. This reminder not only encourages them for their past faithfulness, but also serves as a motivation to continue these good works of love. Just as they have served the saints and continue to serve them, so too they must continue diligently in this work. And this will ensure their continuation in hope of God's promises and blessing. The exhortation not to be sluggish connects to this paragraph back to the beginning of the portion of the letter, where they were reprimanded for their sluggishness. In chapter 5:11. And that verse was, concerning this we have much to explain, and say that it is difficult to explain, since you have become sluggish in hearing. Here they are urged to be diligent, imitating the others who have demonstrated their patient faith and thus inherited the promises for better things that belong to salvation. Now, this is a very interesting connection that this commentary makes that I didn't see, and that's back to 5:11. So when I used to read this text, I would see this, in order that you may not be sluggish, but imitators of those who inherited promises. I usually just saw this as doing the work, serving the saints. But by connecting it back to chapter 5, verse 11, the author is, well, the author is taking this to how they understand the text. The author is taking this all the way back to how they view the Bible, how deeply they understand the Bible. And this is interesting because now Bible knowledge is directly connected with servanthood, which would have an interesting implication. If Bible knowledge is connected to servanthood, then it means you can only serve in as much as you understand the Bible. So if you don't really understand everything, you're not going to serve as well. Or maybe you're going to serve, but you're not going to serve properly, or it's going to be easy for you to fall away once you start serving. It's a very interesting implication by linking chapter 6, verse 12 to 5:11. I would actually like, I see there are a couple of people in the stream. If you have an opinion on this, drop me a comment. How do you think the connection between knowledge and works is being made in this passage? It's my first time seeing this in this text, so that's interesting. Next, I'm going to look at the cultural background. Now, I don't know if there's going to be any cultural background in this passage that's very important, but I have the IVP Cultural Backgrounds commentary, so we can cheat and look if people who have way more knowledge than I do have made any connections in here. Okay, so we're doing chapter 6, verse 8 to 12, 9 to 12. And there is some cultural background stuff that we need to take into account. So first in verse 9, the IVP Cultural Backgrounds Commentary says, Greco-Roman moralists often present their exhortations as reminders, thereby toning down the possible harshness of their words, making them more palatable. We know, of course, that you would never do something like that. When they did think that their readers were likely to pursue such a course, however, they would state matters more harshly, rebuking them. The writer has some reason of confidence in his hearers to stand in. That's verse 10. So yeah, this is a very interesting connection to make at. In the Greek rhetorical manner in the Greco-Roman times, they would oftentimes not directly give an instruction, but they would remind you like, oh, remember I told you to do this. So when the text of Hebrews says, and we desire that each one of you demonstrate their hope in diligence, assurance for love until the end, that you may not be sluggish, but imitators of Christ, those who inherit through faith and patience. This is kind of like him reminding his audience in a way that's softer, that implies he expects his audience to do this. He's not giving them a new moral command in a sense that he expects that they will not keep it. He's giving them a new command in the sense that he's just reminding them, remember to do this. He expects them to keep it. How much did I zoom here? 240. It's not going to fit on this screen, but I can do 200. And then for verse 10, the cultural background commentary says, ministry to the saints probably refers to the financial help. Some suggest that it might refer to continuing effort to help the poor Jerusalem Christians that Paul had initiated. However, with Jerusalem surrounded and Christians having escaped safely into the wilderness, such monies would have been sent elsewhere, even if in Judea. On charity, see the example in Matthew 6. Okay, so the author is probably referring back to, let me just switch screens here because I have to look past the mic the entire time. Yes, that is better. Now I don't have to look past the mic every time I want to speak. Okay, so this is referring back to this ministry that is being done is probably the financial help. So probably. We can't say that for sure, which is an important thing to keep in mind. So yeah, they could have served like in church and helped them with daily lives, but this is probably the collections that Paul started in Acts, when he started collecting, or the apostles when they started collecting for the church in Jerusalem. But because Jerusalem was surrounded and being destroyed at 70 AD, these monies were probably going somewhere else. So the audience in Hebrews, when Hebrews 6 says you demonstrate the same diligence, verse 10, for God is not unjust as to forget your work and love. This is probably part of that money that is going to the audience or the people in other churches. That's interesting. But we'll never know if that was the case. So verse 11 to 12, it's this: we desire that each one of you demonstrate so that you can be imitators and inherit through faith and patience. Ancient moral exhortation often emphasizes imitating positive role models, some of whom this writer will list in chapter 11. As Israel inherited the land, so Judaism said that the righteous would inherit the world to come. So this is a teaching from Judaism. It's not a pure Christian teaching, which is interesting. So we keep our minds always that there is something to be inherited. There is something that God is promising. And I only realize now that he doesn't really say what's being promised. I do suspect in chapter 11, when we are going to the promise that through faith Abraham did this, and he saw something from afar, but he didn't get to inherit it himself. He was hoping in something, and we can reach that. I think in chapter 11, this question of what are we going to inherit is going to be answered. Then we move on to a word study. Now, since this idea of imitators is here so properly, I think I'm going to look at the imitators, not in that book. I want to open up G.K. Beale's Dictionary of New Testament Use of the Old, and why it's not typing. Probably imitate. Why? Don't tell me imitation is not imitate. So cultural backgrounds can close. Let's see, imitate. No, it is not. Imitators of those who inherit promises through faith and patience. I don't really see a word here that I think is important for a word study. So someone dropped a comment, but I don't know what that is about. Person's not online anymore. So I'm going to skip the word studies and I'm going to go on to the biblical timeline and chronology now. So when we look at the biblical timeline, there is a couple of important things that happens throughout the Bible that we need to keep into account. And also when we think of the eschaton and the eschatology, the things still to come, there is some things that we need to keep in mind concerning a timeline. So the first I would always begin with is creation. God created everything. He planted humans in the Garden of Eden, where humans were tempted by a spiritual being, and the fall happened when they ate the fruit against the command of God. And then everything got worse, and then we went into the flood. At Babylon, the nations fell, and God distributed them across the world, and he gave them different languages. He also set their place according to the New Testament. But it's also interesting that if you go to Deuteronomy 32, you'll see that God handed them over to the other angels, or if you're reading Masoretic text, the sons of Israel. But that's referring to the divine council. And now that the world was handed over to the divine council, you see that God is choosing out a new person in Abraham to start following his command. That he chooses out this new person, that you are going to be the one who represents me in this world. You are going to be the one who I choose to plant my next seed, that I'm going to use to live out my name in this world. So from Abraham on, he moves them to Egypt, Abraham's family. They are kept in Egypt for a time, and then by the time they exit with the Exodus, it's a full-on nation. It's not just one person anymore. Now he has a nation that's representing him, and he's making a covenant with that whole nation. And with the nation, he is moving on into the promised land. Now you have a proper nation in a land that's supposed to represent God. But Israel failed. In the time of the judges, everyone did what was right in their own eyes. They didn't follow the Lord. when they start getting kings with Saul and David and Solomon, you see, yeah, there were some of them that were good. There were some good times, good things happening, but most of them ended up in a bad situation. Man, by the time you get to the 2 Kings books and the 2 Chronicle books, you'll see that they are worshipping the Baals. They're not serving the Lord anymore. So the Lord took them away into exile. And after the 70-year period was over, he allowed them to return to the land, but only a small portion of the Jews returned to the land. Most of them stayed in exile. They got comfortable in exile. They didn't see the reason to go back to the land. And that's where Jesus comes. That is the world that Jesus is born into. But even his own nation, in that country he planted, the Jews didn't recognize him. They didn't want to follow him. They chose to crucify him. But he rose from the dead. He went up to heaven. Pentecost happened. The Holy Spirit was poured out and the church was started. And this is one of the churches that we are reading about in this passage. And it's a message to the churches. And we are still today part of this church. We are today still part of this body of believers, even though we are not Jews in the diaspora, even though we are not being tempted to turn our back on Christ. Hopefully, then this is still relevant to us because it's still speaking to us. And in the future, we are still waiting for the eschaton. We are still waiting for the day of the Lord, the day he will return and set his kingdom, restore all of creation, all of those wonderful things that we are waiting for, a day when justice will finally happen. The one thing I think everyone in this world wants, justice. But now we move on to propositions. So now we look for fact statements in this passage. So let's read through the passage again and just look for statements. But even if we are speaking in this way, dear friends, we are convinced of better things concerning you and belonging to salvation. Let's highlight it blue. So the author of this letter was certain that his audience wouldn't turn their back on Christ, that they would keep following the Lord. For God is not unjust. That's an important statement to make. God is not unjust. He will keep his promises. He will do what he said he is going to do. And what won't he forget? What you have demonstrated. So the love you have demonstrated for his name, having served the saints. So once again, this audience was busy doing something. And we desire each one of you to demonstrate the same diligence for the assurance of your hope until the end. So he wants all of them to keep working, all of them to keep serving, so that they, until the end, can receive what they are working for, so that they may not be sluggish. Now, it's interesting that one commentary took it back to chapter 5. They were sluggish in their understanding, but here it's also not sluggish in love, because love is specifically singled out over here in, let's do on fire, in verse 10. So he doesn't want them to be sluggish in knowledge or in love, in the deeds that they are currently doing, but imitators of those who inherit the promises. Let's just highlight it with pink. So, imitators of those who inherit. In chapter 11, we're going to get a whole list of those people. It's going to be Moses, Abraham, David, all the faith heroes. We need to be imitators of them so that we can inherit the promise of God. But then an important one, through faith and patience. Let's make it red. So through faith and patience. Now, that's an important detail, because remember, this was an audience that was tempted to turn their back on Christ. And now that we've done looking at all of the propositions, the fact statements being made. Now we can start interpreting it, and we can ask, what is the perspective I need to read this letter and to fully understand it in the way that the author is writing to his audience? Now, I would say an important perspective here is we need to think of the times when life is going hard, when things are going rough, when we really look at life and we think, man, I don't know what to do. I don't know what is next. I don't know what I am going to do to survive, because the pressure of the world is just so much. Sometimes life just gets so rough that we look at our lives and we think, is it worth following Christ? All this trouble, all this pain I'm going through, is it really worth it? And then we get tempted to start following other things. Maybe it's our bank account, maybe it's our family, maybe it's a comfortable life, but we do get tempted to follow other things. And this is what we need to keep in mind, that we do not lose our focus, that we always keep our eyes on Christ, that we always remember who we are serving. Because think how the Lord has already worked in your life. Think about how he saved you, about the testimony you have. How has he always been there? How has he always provided? Maybe even done some miracles in your life. Think about how the Lord has sanctified you, how he is starting to transform your life. Do you really want to turn your back on that? All this work, all this way you have come. Do you really think that you're going to find something better somewhere else? No, definitely not. And that's why we always keep working. So we're not sluggish. So we can be imitators. And for us, when we think about faith heroes, it would be people like Paul. When Paul was in prison, he was glad because now he can preach the gospel to people who didn't hear the gospel before. When Paul had some people talking rubbish about him in the churches while sharing the gospel, Paul said, I don't care, because Christ is being preached. So when we think about the promise that's in Paul, not just that ultimately we will get to heaven and to become like Christ is with glorification when he returns, but think about becoming someone like Paul. It is possible for us. Becoming someone like the author of the book of Hebrews, it's possible for us. Because we are imitators of them as they are imitators of Christ. But next we're going to look at actions. And actions I'm going to mark with the explanation point because I'm running out of markers. So what are verbs in this text? And also, are they prescriptive or descriptive? Because that's an important distinction. And what can we do? But even if we are speaking in this way, so let's say speaking, and we give that an explanation mark because the author is busy saying something. That doesn't mean that we have to say the same thing in the same way. We don't need to use this Roman technique of reminding people by asking questions. It's a good technique to use. There's nothing wrong with it, but it's descriptive. It's describing what they did. It's not prescriptive that we have to do something. Dear friends, we are convinced of better things concerning you and belonging to salvation, for God is not unjust as to forget. So once again, this is descriptive, not prescriptive, because it's describing how God will not forget what they did. God will not forget your work. So this is once again not saying that we should work. It's just saying that the audience of the book of Hebrews worked, and love by which you have demonstrated for his name by having served the saint and continuing to serve them. And we desire, so this is the desire of the author of the book of Hebrews, each one of you to demonstrate the same diligence. So to demonstrate the same diligence, that would be prescriptive. That's not describing something that they did. That's describing something that they are expected to do, something that we are expected to do. So we are expected to demonstrate the same kind of diligence until the end, in order that we may not be sluggish, but imitators. So we are expected to be imitators. We are expected to be imitators of those who went before us. We are expected to be imitators of the people who already achieved what the Lord wanted them to achieve. Now we ask ourselves, how do we embody this text? How do we become the kind of person that this text describes? You see, a lot of time when we look at the Bible, we look for, what can we do? What's the immediate solution for my problem that I am currently having? And a more important question to ask a lot of times is, what kind of person does the Lord want me to be? Because if I am the right kind of person, I will do what He expects. If I am the kind of person that studies His word and live His word, I will do the things described in the word. But it doesn't mean that you can fake some of the things that's described in the word and now you're going to be the kind of person that keeps God's word. No. You can easily fake being one of those people without actually following. So you need a transformed heart. You need to change your heart to become a kind of person. And in this text, the kind of person is the person who stands strong. It's the person who sees the pressure coming from the world and just thinks, I do not care what happens. I do not care how hard things get. I do not care how tough life is. I am going to follow Christ. That is what Christ expects from me. I do not care who says what, because I am the kind of person who follows Christ. Not because what other people say, not because what of other people might do, but because I am an imitator of Christ. And I am going to keep working. I'm going to diligently keep doing what I am supposed to do until the day of the end, until that time comes when my work is done. And that's the kind of person that this text calls me out to be. So if we look now next to the biblical meta-narrative, the biblical story part over here, this is where we take that timeline of the Bible again, from creation up until the end with the eschaton, with the day of the Lord. And we're going to ask, but how is this pattern repeated in the Bible? So the idea that we see in this passage is people who are suffering for the Lord. People who are standing strong, keep doing His work, keep serving Him, no matter how tough things get. So if we go through our biblical timeline, we will see that there were people throughout history who lived this. But let's start at the beginning with creation. So God created everything. He planted Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, where they were supposed to work and tend the garden. But then they turned their back on the Lord with sin. They ate the fruit where they were not supposed to eat from. And that is where we start seeing this pattern now starting to happen. Now you have to start working through from the sweat of your brow. Now you have to struggle to survive. And the first person we see in the Bible who really follows this pattern is Enoch, because he is proclaiming God's word according to the book of Jude. And people are just not listening to him. People are making fun of him. And this is in the time of the whole Nephilim thing in Genesis 6, where the sons of God, the angels, were having relations with human, and these Nephilim, these giants, were born. And Enoch were warning the people like, hey, you can't do this. Don't be part of this. But the people didn't listen to him. The people didn't believe him. Then we move on to the next person, and that's going to be Noah. Noah preached the word for a good couple of 100 years. Who got onto the ark with him? No one. Noah went to the ark alone with his family. And none of the people he preached for so long followed him. But he said, it doesn't matter, because I am an imitator of the Lord. I am following him. I am following the hope I have in him. I do not care what the other people say. And then the whole Babylon thing happened, and we see after Babylon Abraham. And Abraham is following the Lord. In a world where it seems that no one else is worshipping Yahweh, in a world where it seems no one else is worshipping the Lord, is Abraham the only one there? And he has this covenant with God that he and his family will serve the Lord, no matter what the rest of the world does. And God will bless him if he keeps following. God will give him that blessing. And from Abraham on, we start moving. Let's move all the way to Moses. Moses in the desert, after he just murdered someone. And the Lord meets him there when he thought he is never going to return to Egypt. And the Lord says, go back to Egypt. Lead my people out of exile. And Moses decides, okay, well, I'll go do it. It took some convincing from the Lord getting angry at him before he decided to be loyal to God's word, but he went. And he led the people out of Egypt, and he gave them the law. He made the covenant between Israel and God. Well, not made it, but he was the intercessor role, you can kind of say. And then we see that Israel didn't really follow. You had people like Joshua who wanted to enter the land, but the people didn't want to go. So were exiled for 40 years because the people were sluggish. But Joshua remained faithful. He said, I will follow the Lord. And ultimately, he did enter the promised land. And you see, this is a pattern happening throughout Scripture. And I'm sure you can think of a whole lot more examples. But now I'm going to move on towards the apostles until the end. Because this is the way of Christ. This is what it means when Jesus says, pick up your cross and follow me. Because Jesus was willing to sacrifice himself for the work that God laid out for him. And the apostles follow that exact same way. Most of the apostles were killed except for the apostle John, who was exiled to Patmos. Might have returned to Ephesus before he died, but we're not too sure of that. But we see that now these apostles, the people who walked with Christ, who's picking up the cross after him. Peter was crucified upside down. Why? Because he said, I will follow Christ. I will be that kind of person who stay loyal. I will be that kind of person who inherit the promise. Not the promise of my life will be good now. Not the promise of just be a good person, just follow Jesus and everything will be fine. No. Peter said, I will be a follower of the way of Christ, the way of picking up my cross, the way of dying in myself, and literally dying in his case. Because that was the way how he would be blessed. How he would be in the will of the Lord, in the love of the Lord, with that wonderful relationship that we have discussed earlier in the book of Hebrews. That is how he knew he will have that special place in heaven. He will have somewhere to go in the end. And we fall into that story as well. And that's where our phrase comes in when we summarize this lesson into one sentence. What is the lesson of this passage? For me, well, firstly, it's going to be different for everyone because everyone's going to get a different kind of lesson from this passage. But for me, it would be loyal. Keep on doing. Because there is a promise. So I would word that as something like, be loyal because God will remember. God will remember the work I'm doing. God will remember the work that you're doing. He won't forget. He won't break his promise. Just keep holding on to him no matter who says what. Until next time.